It was supposed to be the start of their dream. Emily and Jack had spent months searching for the perfect house, a fresh start after their wedding, a place to plant roots and build a future. When they found the house, it seemed perfect in every way. New construction, nestled on the outskirts of town, far enough from the noise but still close enough to work and friends. The little cottage-like house, so rustic and modern at the same time, was everything they dreamed of. The couple always dreamed of a quiet life in the country, away from the bustle of the city. They could already imagine the weekends spent in the garden, evenings on the porch with a glass of wine, and cozy nights inside, curled up on the couch. As they drove to the house for the first time, they were ecstatic. The sun was setting. The leaves rustled under the wind as if singing their welcome. "I cannot believe this is ours," Emily said to herself, as she looked outside the window while Jack steered the car. "You deserve this," Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion. "We both do." They pulled into the driveway, lined by young trees still in the early stages of growth. A quiet street led to this house, isolated yet not too far from civilization. Its white walls gleamed against the backdrop of the darkening sky, the front door being a welcoming shade of deep blue. Inside, the house was even more beautiful than they had imagined. There was a kind of peaceful and comfortable openness to the space, with sleek countertops and clean, modern lines that seemed to suggest it was waiting for them. It was when small things began to happen. Nothing alarming at first, but strange enough that they could easily dismiss as coincidence. A door would creak open when they were sure it was shut, or the thermostat would drop several degrees in the dead of night. Emily would get a cold breeze brushing past her as she walked down the hall. All the windows are shut. Jack thought the house was settling, or maybe an older air duct system acting up. Still, there was a sort of unease hanging over them, something they couldn't quite place. It felt like they were being watched, but every time they turned around, no one was there. Then came the first real sign that something was wrong. It was a drizzly Tuesday that Emily sat down to do paperwork for work and Jack to step out for errands. But as she pulled up a local property map on her computer, she thought of it, that she hadn't ever made herself aware of how this neighborhood was laid out. It was curious, to say the least, and something she might soon wish she had let go of. She scrolled through the map, zooming in on their area. But as she looked, something caught her eye. The house wasn't on the map. She zoomed in again, expecting a glitch, but the map was clear. No house, no property lines, nothing. Confused, she grabbed her phone and called Jack. "Hey, can you look something up for me?" she asked, trying to keep the tension out of her voice. "Can you find our address on the city's property map? I can't seem to find it." Jack was quiet for a moment, then chuckled nervously. "Maybe it's a glitch in the map. I'll check when I get back." But when Jack returned, he seemed just as baffled. He couldn't find it either. "Weird," he said. "Maybe it's just a new development. The city probably hasn't updated it yet." But Emily wasn't so sure. She had always trusted maps, and this didn't feel like an oversight. It felt deliberate. The following day, she went to the town planning office to ask for information on that property. She was told with politeness but firm bewilderment that they did not know anything about her house. No permits, no records. It didn't even appear on any of the new developments list. It was as though the house was non-existent at all. "Are you sure you have the right address?" the clerk asked, looking up from her computer. "Of course," Emily replied. "I have the deed right here." She pulled it out and placed it on the counter. The clerk hesitated, then slowly looked at the deed. Her face went pale. You should leave. This isn't something we can help you with." "Wait, what do you mean?" Emily demanded, but the clerk had already turned away, her back rigid. That was when Emily's gut instinct kicked in. Something wasn't right. She didn't know why. but she could feel it deep in her bones. She called Jack, but he dismissed it as a misunderstanding. Maybe it's just a clerical error, don't stress. But Emily couldn't get a feeling that they were kept in the dark about something no one wanted to speak of. A few days later, Emily took matters into her own hands. She went to the local library, searching through old records and newspaper clippings, hoping to find some trace of their land's history. After hours of sifting through dusty files, she stumbled upon something, an old yellowed newspaper from 1922. The article told of a fire that had swept through the very land where their house now stood. A family of 5 had lived there: parents, 2 sons, and 3 young daughters. The fire had started in the middle of the night, and though neighbors rushed to help, the children were trapped inside. The parents, who survived, were never the same afterward, and the house was abandoned, eventually condemned. Emily's hands were shuddering as she read the final lines. The property was left to rot. There was a dark, tragic scar on the land nobody wanted to touch. Over the years, the site had been buried under layers of neglect and time. It was then that Emily understood. Their house, the one that wasn't on the map, was built on the very land where that tragedy occurred. The fire had scarred the earth, and it seemed the house had inherited some of its horrors. When Emily confronted Jack that evening, his disbelief shifted to concern. "This is insane. But we've been here for weeks and nothing's happened, right?" That night, however, was different. It was about 3 a.m. when Emily heard footsteps outside the bedroom. She nudged Jack awake, but he just rolled over and fell back to sleep. She tried to ignore it, but the steps were getting louder and closer until they finally stopped in front of the bedroom door. Her heart was pounding inside her chest, and she held her breath. The doorknob turned slowly, as if someone was trying to open the room. Frozen, Emily barely dared to breathe. The door creaked open a few inches, and in the dim light she saw nothing but darkness. "Jack," she whispered, but turning beside her, he's still asleep, unaware of anything. The door slid shut again, and the footsteps went along the hallway, fading out into nothing. Terrified, Emily did not sleep the rest of the night. By morning, Jack was skeptical, attributing it to a bad dream. But Emily knew what she heard. It wasn't a dream. The next few days were a blur of unease. Strange things began to escalate. Items in the house would be moved from where they were left. Doors would open by themselves, and shadowy figures would flicker at the edges of Emily's vision. It felt as if the house was alive, breathing with a dark energy that was impossible to ignore. And one night, after a particularly chilling sighting of a shadow that seemed to stick to Jack in the kitchen, Emily could no longer hold her tongue. She poured all that she had learned about the fire, the children, the tragedy into Jack's ears. Jack listened, his face pale as he tried to comprehend it. But the moment the story left her lips, everything changed. They were no longer living in a house, they were living in a place haunted by its past. They sought a local historian who also confirmed that the land had many tragic events over the years, but the fire was merely the start. Whispers spread of disappearances, ghostly sights, and unsolved mystery. But the town never said a word about this again. No one dared to say anything regarding the house's name. No one dared talk about what happened. And that is when Emily realized that the house wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by silence, that the people who ignored the history of the house had killed its soul. And the truth, so buried, festered, and grew into a monster. Emily and Jack knew they could not stay. The house had chosen them, but it wasn't a gift. It was a curse. As they packed up their things and prepared to leave, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, even as they walked out the door for the last time. The house, which had never been on the map, would remain a forgotten scar on the land. But Emily and Jack would never forget the terror they had faced and the haunting truth they had uncovered. Before moving on to the next story, if this is your first time, make sure to subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon for the next stories. We need your support. Please share these stories with your friends and family. Thank you. The night was quiet, too quiet. A soft breeze rustled through the trees, the branches gently swaying and casting long shadows against the pale light of the crescent moon. For Rachel, it should have been the perfect start to a new chapter in her life. After years of struggling as a single mother, she'd finally found a home, a place she could give her children the stability they deserved. It was far from perfect, but it was theirs. The old house had walls that were welcoming and seemed to be promising fresh starts. Rachel stood outside. Her fingers touched the doorframe, which was so worn out that she thought it would soon crumble. She breathed in a moment more as she stood before the very shelter where children would spend their days without a speck of violence. Her two children, Lucas and Emma, had endured enough drama. Divorce had torn apart their world, and Rachel knew how much they needed a new start. The house, though old and a little worn around the edges, was beautiful. There was a sense of serenity in the air, something Rachel had craved for so long. The neighborhood was peaceful, neighbors friendly enough, and she couldn't help but think that all of them would find their place here. She smiled at herself, turning around to head into the house. It was one of those dream states. One was afraid to blink in case she would wake up thinking all this is only a dream and will all vanish in air. Inside, Lucas and Emma were already exploring. Lucas, her 12-year-old son, was trying to lug a box twice his size through the room, while Emma, her 9-year-old daughter, giggled and helped with what she could. It was messy, chaotic, but it was their chaos. Rachel smiled, her heart swelling with love as she watched them. "All right, everyone, let's settle in, okay?" Rachel called out. "We'll figure out where everything goes tomorrow. Tonight we rest." Lucas dropped his box onto the floor and plopped onto the couch, looking around at the high ceilings and the old creaky floorboards. "It's kind of creepy, Mom," he muttered, his eyes wide as they scanned the dark corners of the living room. "I think it's charming," Rachel said with a smile. "We'll make it cozy, you'll see." Emma was more enthusiastic and started spinning in circles in the middle of the room. "It is huge. Look at the space to run around." She flopped onto the floor, sprawling out as if she owned the place. Rachel looked around one final time, ensuring that windows were closed and secure, before disappearing into the kitchen to begin unpacking. Itching with an unspoken anxiety, she went about her work while thinking something was off, though at first she tried putting it down to tired thoughts. Moving was always such an ordeal. But the feeling stuck, just a slight, creepy tingle that seemed to hang off the walls themselves. "Mom, I'm tired," Emma called from the living room. Rachel stopped mid-breath. She hadn't realized how late it was. Glancing at the clock on the wall, she saw it was already past midnight. "All right, sweetheart, let's get you to bed." As she tucked Emma into bed, she whispered a quiet goodnight, her fingers brushing her daughter's hair away from her face. Emma's eyes flickered closed, and Rachel lingered a moment, gazing down at her sleeping child. For tonight at least, there was peace. Rachel stood up and walked back toward the living room to find Lucas. He was already sprawled out on the couch, his eyes fixed on the shadows on the wall. The old house creaked as the wind howled outside, rattling the windows. "You okay?" Rachel asked, noticing the unease in his eyes. Lucas nodded but didn't say anything. Something didn't feel right. Rachel put it down to stress of the move and being overtired. "Sleep tight, kiddo. Tomorrow will be better." But sleep wasn't going to come easy that night. The whispers began the very next night. At first, Rachel thought it was just the house settling. Old houses had a way of creaking, groaning, and sighing, especially when the weather changed. But as the days passed, the sounds grew more distinct, more deliberate. It was a soft rustling, a murmur in the walls, a whisper that seemed to come from nowhere. Rachel would be sitting in the living room, folding laundry, and suddenly, she'd hear it, a faint voice, too quiet to make out the words, but too persistent to ignore. "Mom," Lucas whispered one evening, his voice trembling as he stood in the doorway. "Do you hear that?" Rachel paused. She glanced over at him. She hadn't suspected him to notice so quickly, but he had noticed. The whispers had increased, gotten louder and more prevalent. It was as though something or someone was bottled inside the walls, pressing against them, trying desperately to break free. "I mean, it's probably the house," Rachel said, trying to soothe him. "Old houses do pretty weird stuff. It'll blow over." But it did not pass. The whispers grew louder each night. At first, it was the sound of soft voices, then murmurs, words that were almost understandable. The tone was not reassuring. It was tense, urgent. One night, as Rachel lay in bed trying to tune out the disturbing noise, she heard a voice so clearly it made her stomach drop. "Help me, she's coming." Rachel's breath caught. She shot up in bed, heart pounding. She didn't know if she dreamed it, but the words were unmistakable. She sat there a moment, motionless in the dark. The house was silent once more, far too silent. But in the silence, she heard it again, a soft, mournful whisper. "She's coming. She's going to take them all." Rachel's blood ran cold. The voice was far away, but at the same time it was unmistakably clear. A sound of someone suffering. "Mom," Lucas's voice came from the doorway. He was standing there, eyes wide with fear. "Did you hear that?" Rachel didn't answer. Instead, she rushed to the hallway, where Emma stood, clutching her favorite stuffed animal tightly to her chest. "It's okay," Rachel whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "We're just hearing things. Let's go back to bed." But the next morning, Lucas wasn't so sure. "Mom, it's not just the house," he said, his face pale. "I think something's wrong with this place." Rachel didn't want to believe it. She didn't want to think that the house they'd moved into, the house they'd hoped would be their sanctuary, could be anything less than safe. But the whispers, they wouldn't stop. Rachel delved into the history of the house. The neighbors were quiet, and most of them were friendly, but no one seemed to know anything about the past history of the house. It had stood there vacant for a while before Rachel took up residence there, and when she questioned people around about the owner before her, they just gave evasive responses and sidelong glances. One day, a neighbor, an elderly woman who happened to live down the street, Mrs. Aldridge, stopped by with one of her homemade pies. She chatted a while with Rachel, as a guest always did when staying with her. "Do you know anything about the owners before us?" Rachel said with all innocence, but her question laced with an undercurrent in the voice. Mrs. Aldridge's face dropped, her eyes darkening. "You're in that house?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. Rachel nodded. "Yes, we moved in a few weeks ago. But something strange is happening. Whispers, noises." Mrs. Aldridge's hand was shaking as she placed the pie on the counter of the kitchen. "Oh dear. I hope you do not need to know this, but an old house holds some sort of history. But this is tied with something terrible," she explained. "What are you saying?" Rachel asked, racing her heart. "There was a family that lived there before," Mrs. Aldridge started, her voice low and hesitant. "The mother, Sarah, she was a kind woman, but she had a dark side. Her husband died under mysterious circumstances, and soon after, she disappeared. No one really knew what happened to her, but after she left, the house was empty for years. People say, People say the house is cursed. Rachel listened intently, her stomach churning. Cursed? Mrs. Aldridge nodded grimly. There was a tragedy, something horrible. They say Sarah, she wasn't the same after her husband died. And the whispers? People say it's the voice of the husband, trapped in the walls, trying to warn others of what happened. Rachel's mind was reeling. She had to know more. She needed to understand what was happening in her home. The more Rachel uncovered, the more terrifying the truth became. Sarah, the previous owner, had been in a state of madness before she disappeared. She had left behind a journal, hidden in the attic, and Rachel found it one cold afternoon. The brittle pages yellowed with age. The entries were fragmented, but one passage stood out. Shall come, shall carry them all, and it will be my fault. As Rachel read the words, a cold wind blew. Through the room and again, the whisper came. She's coming for you. Rachel's heart pounded in her chest. She knew now with terrible certainty that the whispers were not just some quirk of the house. They were a warning that something terrible was about to happen. The same fate that had consumed Sarah's family was now reaching for hers. That night, the house was full of living nightmare dread. The whispers screamed more loudly than ever as it now sounded filled with voices, dozens of people begging, screaming. "Run!" that voice shouted. "She's here. She's gonna take them all." Rachel dashed into Emma and Lucas' rooms, but then stopped. And inside those rooms were not present. No person, but beds sat vacant and open windows that left it open for howling winds through the dark nights. Then she heard it the faintest sound, a soft, cold whisper in her ear. "You can't save them." With tears in her eyes and her heart shattering, Rachel ran into the night, searching for her children. The house had claimed them, and the whispers, their cries, echoed in the walls as Rachel vanished into the dark. No one ever saw Rachel or her children again. And the house? It stands, waiting for the next family, waiting for the whispers to begin again. It was the stuff that dreams were made of. A colonial-style home that sat just on the outskirts of quiet town, roomy enough, charming enough, a fresh start for the brand-new life they shared together. The house was more than they'd ever been able to hope for. The white picket fence, flower beds, cozy rooms. It was perfect. But one thing neither of them had quite prepared them for was the basement. It was an unfinished space, dark and damp, with old wooden beams that seemed to groan with every step. It had been used for storage by previous owners and didn't seem like anyone had ever ventured down there for years. The door was thick and heavy, and the latch clicked shut, sealing what secrets lay beneath the house. For weeks, the basement was nothing but a vague curiosity, a place they hadn't explored yet but promised to get to eventually. That was until the night Evan decided to venture down. It had been a quiet evening. Mia had spent the evening reading a book in the living room, the soft hum of the fireplace filling the air. Evan had gotten through his work in the study and was wandering around the house, getting a feel for the space. The basement door caught his eye. He remembered that they hadn't been down there yet. Curiosity tugged at him, and with a soft sigh, he decided to check it out. Just to see what's down there, he told himself. As he descended the wooden stairs, the cold air of the basement swept over him, chilling him to the bone. The light flickered when he turned it on, casting long, strange shadows that stretched across the walls. Dust particles swirled in the air like ghostly whispers, and the scent of damp wood and mildew made him wrinkle his nose. At first, it was nothing. Just old boxes and unused furniture and forgotten trinkets. He had to move past them as he inspected the far corner where the light barely seemed to reach. That's when he noticed it. A shape. At first, Evan thought it was his own shadow, cast by the dim light above. But as he turned to face the corner, the shadow didn't move with him. It remained still, stretched unnaturally tall, like the silhouette of a person who shouldn't have been there. A chill ran down his spine. He took a careful step back, his breath going out in shallow gasps. The shadow seemed to shift slightly, its form warping before his eyes. The darkness wasn't just darkness. It was something alive, something that seemed to see him too. With his heart pounding, Evan backed up toward the stairs. He didn't dare take his eyes off the shadow, but when he turned to climb up the steps, it was gone. He stood at the top of the stairs, panting, his palms slick with sweat. Mia looked up from her book when Evan emerged from the basement, his face pale and his eyes wide. "Evan? What's wrong? What's wrong?" "Nothing," he said quickly, shaking his head. "It's just, I don't know. The basement, it's nothing." But Maya could see something had shaken him. He was usually a brave man, confident and steady, but tonight there was an unmistakable tremor in his voice. The following days, Evan couldn't sleep. He was restless, with nights that seemed to be haunted by the feeling of being watched. His mind kept going back to that shadow, the way it had stood still, like it was waiting for him to leave so it could follow him. He tried to push it out of his mind, but every time he was alone, he felt it again, the oppressive presence, lingering just out of sight. It wasn't long before the shadow began to appear in other parts of the house. First, it would slide a corner of the living room where the light didn't reach, a glimpse from the hallway when they passed by. But soon it grew bolder. One night, Maya woke to find the shadow standing at the foot of their bed. Her heart pounded as she lay frozen beneath the covers, her eyes wide with fear. "Evan," she whispered. He stirred beside her, mumbling something incoherent as he turned over. The shadow seemed to move closer, stretching along the floor like something out of a nightmare. The shadow was suffocating, stealing the very air from the room. Finally, Evan woke up, feeling the tension in the air. He sat up and looked around the room with his eyes, but by the time he looked over, the shadow was gone. He shook his head, his heart racing. "Maya, what happened? What did you see?" "I don't know. It was here, in the room." She could barely get the words out, right there, in front of us. Evan's face set. He reached over to the side of their bed and turned on the lamp, casting light through the room. There was nothing there. The appearances grew more frequent and more violent. The shadow followed them through the house, moving faster, always lurking just beyond their vision. Evan started hearing things at night, footsteps in the hallway, whispering voices in the dark. It felt as though the house itself was alive, pressing in on them. One evening, sitting together in the living room, the shadow reappeared. This time, it took a more concrete form, a silhouette of a tall man but without a face. It flickered like a dark flame. The air around it became cold. Mia gasped, clutching Evan's arm. "Oven, do you see that? What is it?" "I don't know," Evan breathed, his voice tight. "I saw it before. It's the same shadow." The shadow approached further, and the room plunged to such an incredible temperature that they could actually see their breath. Without any warning, the shadow bolted across the room and plunged into a corner. The air was full of electricity, and for a moment, they both could almost smell this ancient, dark presence which might break loose at any second. Evan sprang to his feet, pulling Mia to him. "We have to get out of here, now." For the next few days, the pair tried to seek answers. They searched through the town's history, rummaging through dusty records and talking to the old-timers who had lived there for decades. It was then that they heard the house's dark history. It was many decades ago that a family had lived in the house. The family had a sad history. The father, a man named Harold Dunn, was a familiar figure in town, but his family had been afflicted by mysterious deaths. One by one, his wife, his children, even the family dog, had died under strange and unexplained circumstances. Whispers around town suggested that Harold had been involved in dark rituals, practices meant to summon and control spirits. They said he had attempted to bargain with something old, something evil, and that the price had been the lives of his loved ones. The town had long since buried the story, but the death toll had been high, and the whispers persisted. Some said Harold's soul had never left the house, that it had merged with the dark force he had summoned, taking on a malevolent form that haunted the basement. On the night of their discovery, the shadow grew violent. It swam against the walls of the house, its presence overwhelming. They could hear voices, frantic, broken whispers that seemed to call their names. Maya and Evan knew what they had to do. They could no longer run from the evil that had bound itself to their home. Armed with the knowledge of the past, they descended into the basement once more. The air was thick, suffocating, the temperature dropping by the second. And there, in the middle of the basement, stood the shadow, a man-shaped silhouette, flickering like a candle in the wind. It was waiting for them. Evan stepped forward, his heart racing but his resolve firm. He whispered the words from the old records, the incantations that might bind the spirit to the house forever. The shadow recoiled, flickering more violently, but as the words echoed in the basement, the shadow began to shift. It screamed. It was inhuman, a scream of wrath and pain that seemed to rip apart the very stuff of reality. The walls were shuddering and the temperature had dropped to Arctic. And then, as abruptly as it had started, the shadow was gone. The silence that fell was oppressive. For a moment, Maya and Evan stood there in the basement, shivering, their breathing ragged, their bodies numb with cold. The house was silent. But was it secure? They didn't know. But one thing was sure. The shadow was gone, at least for now. And whatever that was left in the dark of the basement would never be understood.